Welcome to A1 Storyteller, where we don't just tell stories, we take you on a journey through emotion, humanity, and those unexpected moments that touch the soul. In a world so often distracted by noise, headlines, and controversy, sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones. The moments we almost miss, the gestures no one demanded, yet everyone needed, the ones that don't make history books, but somehow make history in the hearts of millions. Today, we bring you one such story. It's about a royal guard, a man of duty and silence, who stood soaked in a relentless rainstorm, never once flinching. His commitment was more than just tradition. It was built on years of service, sacrifice, and the kind of discipline that most people can't even imagine. But as the sky poured down over Windsor Castle, something happened, something unexpected. Not from his commanding officers, not from the public, but from a little girl with a heart as big as her crown. Princess Charlotte, just 9 years old, did something that would stop the nation in its tracks and melt even the iciest of hearts. She didn't make a speech, she didn't call for cameras, she simply picked up an umbrella and stood beside him. But that moment, that single, silent gesture, became a symbol of compassion, of unity, of how power isn't always loud, and kindness doesn't care about age, rank, or royal blood. So settle in, because this isn't just a story, it's a reminder of what still makes us human. This is A1 Storyteller. Windsor Castle had seen centuries pass, wars, coronations, triumphs, and tragedy. But that spring afternoon, it bore witness to something quietly remarkable. Dark clouds had loomed since early morning, their shadows stretching across the manicured lawns. A low rumble of thunder began to roll just after midday, and soon after, the rain started falling. By 3 o'clock, it was a full-on storm. At the gate of the East Quadrangle, standing like a statue carved from steel and discipline, was Sergeant Thomas Whitaker of the Coldstream Guards. He'd been stationed there since 11 that morning. Protocol dictated he wouldn't be relieved until 4. To the public, the Royal Guards were symbols, stiff-backed, emotionless, unmovable. But underneath the ceremonial regalia was a man with aching muscles, soaked clothes, and a mind trained to ignore discomfort. Thomas was that man. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, seen men fall, seen chaos, seen moments where he had to decide in a heartbeat whether to pull the trigger. Compared to that, this rain was child's play. But even so, the hours were beginning to weigh on him. His jaw clenched. Rainwater trickled down the back of his collar, beneath his red coat. He didn't blink. He didn't blink. He didn't move. That was his job, to stand in silent tribute, no matter the cost. Unbeknownst to him, the cost would be repaid in a way he never imagined. Princess Charlotte was known among palace staff as curious, kind-hearted, and surprisingly insightful for her age. She often asked questions others were too shy or too busy to raise. That day she had been scheduled to join her mother, the Princess of Wales, for an indoor tea lesson in the Rose Room. But something caught her attention as she passed the east-facing window. The rain. And the man. He hadn't moved since she glanced down an hour ago. Now soaked, his chin high, his eyes locked forward. "Why doesn't he come inside?" she asked aloud. Catherine looked over her tea. "He can't, sweetie. He's on duty." "Oh, but it's cold." "Why no? Can't someone bring him an umbrella?" Charlotte paused, then stared back out, her small brow furrowed. "I'm going to bring him one." Her mother gently laughed. "That's very sweet, but the guards are trained to stay in place no matter what." Charlotte turned slowly. "Even if it's a princess asking?" Catherine's smile softened. Even then, love, but the seed had been planted. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker wasn't a man who sought attention. He didn't chase medals or glory. His life was built on quiet honor, the kind that doesn't need applause to be real. Born in a modest home in Yorkshire, Thomas grew up surrounded by hard-working parents and the scent of coal smoke and rain on old bricks. His father was a welder, his mother a nurse. Together, they taught him 3 simple rules. Tell the truth, work hard, and never walk past someone who needs help. By 18, Thomas had joined the British Army, not for adventure, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. He enlisted in the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the world, charged with guarding the monarch and serving on the front lines when called upon. He was sent to Afghanistan at 21. He returned 2 years later, quieter. He'd seen things he never spoke about, lost friends, endured months in remote, hostile mountains where every step could mean a landmine and every shadow might hide a sniper. But through it all, he stood his ground. They started calling him the Rock after a particularly brutal mission, when he held a checkpoint alone for 7 hours so an evacuation could continue. When asked later how he stayed calm while bullets flew around him, he simply said, "Someone had to stand. So I did." Now, years later, he was stationed in ceremonial service, wearing a bright red tunic and the tall bearskin hat that tourists always gawked at. To outsiders, it seemed like pageantry. But to Thomas, it was sacred. It was respect. It was history. Still, nothing in his training could prepare him for the storm that rolled over Windsor Castle that day. The wind howled with a low, mournful growl. Raindrops the size of pebbles beat down on him. His coat, impeccably pressed at the start of his shift, was now plastered to his skin. His boots were soaked, and his neck ached from the sheer weight of the wet bearskin. Yet Thomas didn't move. Protocol stated he couldn't, unless directly ordered or threatened. His breathing slow. He entered what soldiers call the zona, a space where time blurs and pain dulls, and all that exists is the mission. The tourists had long since scattered, their umbrellas no match for the sideways sheets of rain. The flag overhead whipped violently, and the gravel beneath his boots began to puddle. Thomas blinked once in 15 minutes. Water dripped from his chin like a leaky pipe. He didn't know anyone was watching. He didn't know his moment of service was about to become a moment the world would never forget. On the other side of Windsor Castle, within a warm drawing room, lit by antique chandeliers and perfumed with lavender tea, a very different scene was unfolding. Princess Charlotte, dressed in a navy blue pinafore with white tights and her chestnut hair tied in a neat ponytail, sat at a windowsill with her nose pressed against the glass. Her little fingers left foggy prints on the cold pane. Behind her, a table was neatly set with fine china for an etiquette lesson she was meant to be taking with her governess. But Charlotte wasn't listening. She was watching. Outside the window, through the sheets of grey rain, she saw him, the guard. He hadn't moved. Not once. Not even when thunder rolled overhead like distant cannons. Not when the wind tossed leaves and sticks across the stone path like confetti. The little princess frowned. He must be freezing, she thought. She turned toward her mother, the Princess of Wales, who had just entered the room. "Mummy," Charlotte said softly. "Why is he still out there?" Catherine paused, glancing outside. She saw the guard too. "He's on duty, darling. But he's all wet." "I know, sweetheart." Charlotte looked back. "Is he not allowed to move? Is he not allowed to move? Only if there's danger, or if he's given a command." But the silence hung between them. Charlotte turned again, her voice firmer now. "Can I bring him an umbrella?" Catherine gently laughed, taken aback by the innocence and earnestness in her daughter's voice. "That's very kind of you, but guards don't usually accept help, even from us." "It's part of their service." Charlotte stood up, her eyes serious now. "But it's not right." Before her mother could reply, Charlotte left the room, down the hall, down the wide staircase echoing with each of her small footsteps, past the surprised but silent staff who knew not to interfere with a Windsor child on a mission. And in her little hand, she carried her favourite umbrella, a bright pink one, with tiny purple butterflies on the fabric. It was small, child-sized, and barely useful in real rain. But to Charlotte, it was enough. Two royal aides exchanged glances. One made a call to Catherine. Within minutes, the Princess of Wales appeared, coat in hand, catching up to her daughter at the eastern door of the castle. Charlotte, she called gently. The little princess turned, still holding the umbrella like a sword. Her mother knelt beside her. Let's go together. Charlotte smiled. The rain was heavy outside, but together they stepped into it, mother and daughter, side by side. The cameras didn't capture the conversation. They didn't catch the soft way Catherine adjusted the umbrella, or how Charlotte kept looking up at the tall man standing in the rain. But what happened next, the world would come to know. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, still locked in position like a statue carved from duty itself, began to feel a shift in the air. Not from the weather, it still thundered overhead, but from something gentler, softer. Like the presence of a spring breeze sneaking into a bitter winter storm. His eyes, sharp and trained to remain forward, noticed movement from the edge of his peripheral vision. He didn't turn. He didn't dare break protocol. But what he saw was impossible to ignore. A small figure, no taller than his waist, approached him, her steps splashing quietly in shallow puddles. She moved without fear, without hesitation, as though drawn by something stronger than rules. In her hands, she held a delicate pink umbrella with purple butterflies dancing across the brick. It was Princess Charlotte. Beside her, gracefully holding a hand over her shoulder, walked her mother, the Princess of Wales, her dark coat flowing gently in the wind. A guard's earpiece crackled nearby, but no one moved to stop them. Even the most disciplined staff understood. This moment was not to be interfered with. Charlotte stepped right in front of Thomas, lifting her small umbrella as high as her arm could stretch. The crowd of royal photographers had returned by now, standing a distance away behind the gate. But their lenses clicked rapidly, capturing what no one expected to see, a young royal child shielding a soaked guardsman from the rain. Could hear the soft patter of rain against the nylon of her umbrella, could sense the sheer warmth of her gesture cutting through the numbness of his soaked uniform. For a moment, no one spoke, and then something broke the silence. A tiny voice, gentle, determined. "Ah, you don't have to be wet anymore," Charlotte said, looking up at him, blinking through the rain. Thomas's heart clenched. He wanted to respond, to say something. Anything, but the rules held his mouth shut. He was bound by code, by ceremony, by unspoken contracts written long ago between soldier and crown. But then something remarkable happened. Charlotte reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card, handwritten in careful, wobbling cursive. It read, "Thank you for protecting us. You're very brave." Thomas blinked. His throat tightened. It was the first time in all his years in service that someone, anyone, had offered him something so simple, so sincere, and so unexpected. Her mother stepped forward and gently guided Charlotte back a few paces, letting the umbrella remain tilted over his shoulder. And then, breaking from centuries of rigid custom, Catherine, Princess of Wales, gave a subtle nod toward Thomas. It wasn't a command, it wasn't an order, it was permission. Just enough. Thomas, soaked to the bone, finally moved. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look down. And he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk, just a soft, grateful smile from a soldier who'd stood for others his whole life. Only to find that, today, someone had finally stood for him. It started with a single photograph, an image snapped by a sharp-eyed photographer named Marcus Vale, who'd returned to Windsor Castle, hoping to catch some candid royal shots before the rain swallowed the day entirely. The photo was perfect, almost unreal. In the centre stood Sergeant Thomas Whitaker, soaked and unmoving. Beside him, tiny and defiant, stood Princess Charlotte, holding a butterfly umbrella just above his shoulder. Her face glowed with kindness, while his was carved with pride and disbelief. By evening, the photo had gone viral. Social media platforms lit up like fireworks. On X, formerly Twitter, it racked up over 5 million likes in the first 8 hours. On Instagram, it became the most shared royal image since Queen Elizabeth's funeral. Reddit threads exploded with admiration, like hashtags like #umbrella for the brave, #princess of hearts, and #royal respect trended worldwide. But more than the stats, it was the comments that revealed how deeply this moment had touched people. My father served 22 years in the army. He cried seeing this, said it was the first time he felt seen. At Honor Date 83, a Princess Diana would be proud. This is exactly the kind of compassion she taught the world. At Windsor Watcher, this little girl did more for morale in one rainy moment than any speech ever could. At Real Royal Moments news outlets across the globe scrambled to report on the event. Morning shows invited royal experts. Military analysts praised the depth of the symbolism. Even late-night comedians paused the jokes to highlight the story, and many wiped away a tear doing so. Inside Windsor Castle, the royal family held a quiet dinner that night. William looked across the table at his daughter, who was buttering her peas with intense focus. "You did something special today," he said. Charlotte glanced up, puzzled. "I just didn't want him to get sick." He smiled. "That's what makes it special." Catherine leaned over and gently kissed her daughter's temple. Far away, in a modest flat in Yorkshire, Thomas's mother, Margaret Whittaker, clutched her teacup as she saw the news. Tears streaked down her wrinkled cheeks. She whispered to the screen, "If that's my boy, and Thomas?" Well, he stood in silence still, because duty didn't pause for fame. But deep inside, where medals can't reach, something had changed, something had healed. He was no longer just a man in uniform. He was a man who had been seen. The days that followed were unlike anything Sergeant Thomas Whittaker had ever known. He'd spent most of his life behind the iron curtain of military stoicism. Trained to take orders, not compliments, taught to serve in silence, not shine in spotlights. But now, suddenly, the world was watching him, not for his precision, not for his salute, but for the way he had simply stood. It started with a knock on his modest door at the barracks. A fellow guardsman, half smiling and red-faced, carried a canvas bag stuffed full of letters. "A fan mail, mate," the soldier said, placing it on the floor. "I didn't know you were the Queen's heartthrob." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Inside the bag were handwritten letters, dozens of them. From children, veterans, strangers in America, a nurse in Kenya, an elderly woman in Wales who remembered watching the Queen's coronation as a child. All of them said the same thing in different ways. "A thank you for standing. You reminded me what honor looks like. That little princess saw what we've always seen." His hands trembled as he opened a small envelope. It was a drawing, crayoned in bold colors, of him in his red tunic, with Charlotte beside him under a big pink umbrella. At the bottom in wobbly handwriting were the words, "You're my hero." Daisy, age 7, Thomas smiled, his throat tight. But it didn't stop there. The next day, a video appeared online. It was old footage from his tour in Afghanistan, grainy, shaky, recorded by a fellow soldier. It showed Thomas carrying an injured comrade through an active firefight, shielding him with nothing but his own body. The footage had never aired publicly before, and suddenly the world understood something deeper. This man hadn't just stood in the rain. He had stood in the fire. "Ku Pachia," Zee said in the fire. In response, the Ministry of Defence released a formal statement of gratitude. Local schools in Yorkshire held assemblies to talk about honour and service. One school even designated as Thomas Whittaker Kindness Day. But the moment that truly floored him came quietly. A sealed envelope arrived, pure white, with the royal crest pressed in gold. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Sergeant Whittaker, you served your country with courage and your queen with grace. You reminded our daughter of the values we hold dearest, kindness, empathy, and strength. For that, we thank you. Warmly, William and Catherine, Prince and Princess of Wales. At the bottom was a small message in blue ink, clearly added afterward in a child's looping script. I'll bring you an umbrella any time. Love, Charlotte. Issy. Thomas closed the letter and sat back in his chair, hands resting on the arms like the soldier he was. For the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears, not from loss, not from pain, but from something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Belonging, Zafonging. Princess Charlotte wasn't entirely sure why the world kept talking about what she did. To her, it was simple. The man looked cold, so she brought him her umbrella. That's what Mummy always said. If you can help, you should. But now, wherever she went, people smiled differently. They called her kind, compassionate, a little Diana. At first, she didn't understand. But then something happened that made her realize just how much her gesture had meant, not just to the man in red, but to everyone who watched. It came in the form of a school visit. Charlotte and her brothers were scheduled to visit a local children's hospital and reading centre, something the royal children did occasionally as part of their upbringing. That day, as they entered the brightly decorated hall filled with books and crayons and smiling nurses, something stood out. Something. On the wall was a huge poster. It showed her, holding the umbrella. Above it were the words, "Be the kindness you wish to see in the world." Charlotte's eyes widened. Dozens of children, some in wheelchairs, some with eye drips, had drawn versions of that same image. Some with glitter, some with glue, some with scribbles and bent paper. But all of them said the same thing in the way only children can. I want to be like her. One little girl with a bald head and missing teeth ran up and hugged Charlotte suddenly. "Thank you for being nice to the soldier," she whispered. "Me daddy's in the army too." Charlotte hugged her back tightly, blinking away the sting in her eyes. That night, back in the palace, she sat on the edge of her bed as her mother brushed out her hair. "Mummy," she asked, "and was it really that important, the umbrella?" Catherine paused, placing the brush gently on the dresser. She knelt before her daughter, looking into those earnest, searching eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, it was one of the most important things you've ever done." "But why?" "I just did what felt right. Because sometimes the world forgets to do what feels right, and then someone small reminds them." Charlotte leaned into her mother's arms, thinking hard. Outside, the wind had calmed. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in days, the skies above Windsor were clear. Sir, the world had changed, not through power, not through command, but through compassion in the shape of a child's pink umbrella. And in a kingdom known for its tradition, a 9-year-old princess had quietly rewritten what royalty meant. Weeks passed, but the moment remained immortal. The image of Sergeant Thomas Whittaker and Princess Charlotte became more than just a viral sensation. It became a symbol. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about kindness. Military leaders cited it in speeches about unity and the unseen sacrifices of servicemen. Even Parliament referenced the moment when discussing new funding for veterans' mental health services. But the biggest recognition of all came quietly and privately. A ceremony was held in the Queen's Gallery, intimate, elegant, and far away from the public eye. Only a select group of royals, family, and military dignitaries were present. Charlotte clutched her mother's hand as she watched Thomas step forward in full ceremonial uniform, shining boots, flawless medals, spine straight with dignity and pride. Before him stood King Charles III. He smiled, not as a monarch, but as a man moved by something deeper. For outstanding service, the king began, his voice clear and steady, and not only to crown and country, but to the soul of this nation. "Sergeant Whittaker, you have reminded us all of the quiet power of duty, and the unexpected grace of compassion." And then, in a moment that made history, King Charles pinned a rare Royal Commendation Medal upon Thomas's chest. The room erupted in respectful applause. But Thomas, he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Charlotte. She was grinning now, shy but proud, her tiny frame somehow carrying the weight of the nation's renewed hope. Later, outside in the garden, they met again. This time, no umbrellas, just blue skies. Charlotte handed him a small envelope. Inside was another drawing. This time, it was the two of them standing under a rainbow, with the words, "Even in the rain, we can shine." Thomas knelt down to eye level, looked into her eyes and whispered, "You helped me remember why I serve." She blinked. "But you're the brave one," he smiled. "You're the one who reminded me that courage doesn't always wear boots. Sometimes it wears pink sneakers." They laughed together. In that moment, no guards, no royals, no photographers, just a soldier and a little girl. The divide between their worlds melted away. And so did the weight of silence. We see. And so, on a rainy day outside Windsor Castle, something extraordinary happened. Not through war, not through wealth, but through one simple act of kindness. A child, too young to know politics, too innocent to know power, reminded a nation and the world that true royalty isn't about crowns or castles. It's about compassion and honor. It isn't always rewarded in medals or titles. Sometimes it's rewarded with a small umbrella and the warm smile of a little girl who dared to care. At A1 Storyteller, we believe that some of the most powerful stories aren't made in headlines. It was about us all, about seeing those who stand quietly in the background and choosing to stand beside them. If this story moved you, share it. If it reminded you of the strength in kindness, leave a comment. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe to A1 Storyteller, where every tale is told with purpose, power, and heart. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life. Until next time, stand tall, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of a single human moment. A1 Storyteller.